Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I appreciate you guys all being here. Um, I have a lot of images to show you guys, so I should probably start to move through them kind of quickly. I'd first like to start by describing my work in 5 different ways. So I'm going to describe it in terms of what it is physically, in terms of material. I'd like to talk about it in terms of idea and concept. I'm going to try my hand at describing it in a poetic metaphor. I might fall flat in relationship to other artists and then in relationship to other academic disciplines. So here's a picture that I'll eventually go back to. And this is actually sort of a wall full of usable tools, but for me, these are all materials that I end up using to make sculptures out of. So when I use this work, it's a lot of woodworking, but it's actually me using the object for its form and what it's brought with it. I do ceramics, so part of making ceramics is starting with clay and firing an object and making this very permanent kind of material. And here's sort of something from the opposite end of when objects start to move back into being just material. In terms of idea and concept, I'm very much interested in using objects to tell stories and point to certain things. And something I'm always working through is this idea of low to high and how that reverberates through culture and through class. So here's a picture of a gallery space I installed with a series of pallets, thinking about the pallet as a stand-in for a type of very, very low-rung migrant worker, right? Pallets travel around as needed. Oftentimes you'll see them being collected to be used again or being used as firewood. So these were all collected pallets, and the idea was that I would install them and start to treat them like very high-end objects, like art objects. Sort of break them out of that cycle for a while if I could. But also with that in mind, this is a palette that I have made to sort of take my labor at this very sort of high-end art production and make something to give back that goes into being a palette, sort of recirculate it. So just my thinking or a description of it. Someone once described my work as a grand quest of democratizing objects. That's my falling short poetic metaphor. And here, it's what this piece is called material memory, and it's using a local clay from a riverbed, and is formed into these ready-made, industrially made cups, and the local clay records the memory of the breaking of the cup, right? And so they come together, right? So they're very similar in terms of what they are in material, and now they have a relationship where one supports the other and the memory of the other. As far as artists I'm interested in, I'm very interested in ideas of craft, and so Martin Perrier is a very influential artist for me. It's particularly the relationship to material and use of skill in creating the works. He's a masterful woodworker. Here's another piece of Martin Perrier. This piece is called Ladder for Booker T. Washington. It's one of his more famous and well-known pieces. Right? But again, it's about the skill it takes to make the ladder. I'm also very much interested in objects and the meanings of objects, as I've been describing so far. This is work by Betty Saar, and I'm interested in this work because with several subtle adjustments, right, the work can take on some new meaning and become a lot more powerful, right? So all these are very sort of common objects, somewhat antiques, right? But with the way it's put together, with some embroidery, with a small amount of printing, connecting of a chain, it becomes much more powerful talking about labor and oppression. And lastly, to talk about it from maybe a bit more of an interdisciplinary lens, I'm really interested in a material culture theory, and that's when a lot of disciplines start overlapping, right? So when you have economists all of a sudden start thinking about things outside of just economics. It's when humanity starts being more concerned about objects. I'm showing this image because with this consideration to objects and what they can do, I'm interested in how they can tell a story. So we know that we can look at pottery shards and the images illustrated on them to start to piece together narratives and parts of the past, but I also think that we could do that in the future. And so I like those kinds of connections. These are a series of cups I made a very long time ago, just trying to parallel what I consider our modern mythologies of celebrities and the stories we have around them to the past. Okay, so here we are back to this pile of materials for me. At this point, I want to talk about 3 different bodies of work. I'm going to start talking about a residency that I participated in West Virginia. I'm then going to talk about the Youngstown State University show of last year, and then I'm going to finish talking about some current work that's being exhibited in Providence, Rhode Island at a gallery called the World's Fair. So, this stock of materials is what I was using during this residency called Brickscape in West Virginia. The space for the residency was here in the Union Building in downtown Charleston. And our space was up on the 11th floor. Now, I don't know if you guys could see it. This is it right here. That's the 11th floor. Okay? And it was a great space. It was an excellent layout of a modern office building built in the early 20th century. It had all the original woodworking. It was great. The real catch about the beginning of this residency was there was no elevator to get to the 11th floor. Okay, so naturally, my inclination is to go to the library, right? So this is the Union Building. It's from a postcard that I found looking through the library in Charleston. And you could see how it's right here on the Kanawha River. All of these buildings down here on the riverbank are all gone, but a lot of the ones in the background are still there. Right? In West Virginia, as I was spending time researching in the historical archives, the state historical archives, has a long labor history. When West Virginia seceded from Virginia, it felt that it was being neglected for all of its resources. And so when it seceded, during the Civil War, it opened itself up to new labor forces, and that was freed slaves and immigrants coming in from the East, right? So the origin of West Virginia is actually very, very intersectional in how they populated the state with a workforce. And so looking at a lot of these photos, I was very surprised to see this amount of brown faces and people of color. Even in this case, up here, if you look at this very handsome gentleman in the nice suit or uniform, his job is a marshal, right? Which is compared to being a miner or a lumber worker, is a very elevated point of status. And so I thought that was so notable. So, oh yeah, and this is another image, a testament to how intersectional early West Virginia was, where at one of the mines you could see how many different languages they had to put the sign into. Right, but with all of this labor, there's often divisions. And many a times, these divisions of labor, who does what, who gets to do what, happen along the lines of race. West Virginia also, in its history of labor, was known for maybe the 20th century's, or at least North America's, worst industrial disaster, which was called the Hawk's Nest Incident. And at the New River Gorge, at a place that was called the Gauley Bridge in Franklin County, they started building a hydroelectric dam in 1930, and they wanted to expedite this project. So in order to expedite the project, they started recruiting workers from the South, from Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, to come and work continually in building this tunnel. There was about 3,000 workers working to bore this tunnel, and they were actually drilling into silica, which is another term for it in terms of stone is flint. And what that is essentially where we get a glass powder from. And it's very, very dangerous to breathe. And so as they were working on this project, By the time it was completed, I think about 300 people had died on site, and then the historical record was that about 700 total had died from acute silicosis out of 3,000, right? And what really struck me about this was through the recruiting from the South, about 65 to 70% were Black migrant workers that came to work on this particular tunnel, right? So this idea of the division of labor, who gets to do what, and how it gets set up around race became very clear looking back through West Virginia's history. So whatever you're thinking about the Hawks Nest Tunnel right now, I'd like you to hold that thought, right? I'm gonna get back to this in just a second, okay? So my work for this residency, for my installation, was taking one of these old office rooms and turning it into my installation site. So as you walk in to this entrance, I have a collage set up, right, of a lot of the images that I was looking at in the historical archives, but also different pieces of fine furniture of the 20th century. So, and if you can, I don't know if you can see the pointer, if you can notice this little shelf right here, you're gonna see this again in just a second. So this is the entrance on the way into the installation. And what I was doing, I was taking those old wooden ladders and hand tools, and I was recreating them into furniture forms to essentially lay out an office space. Right? So you can see this is an old step ladder, modified, take on the form of a desk. Another smaller step ladder, modified to take on the form of an armchair. Right? And then across from the desk, what would have been the bookshelf, right, is this other very, very long ladder made into that very similar form that I just pointed out a second ago. I don't know if at the time I was aware of that. I think I was working and looking for resolves with the material for what my intention was. But looking back in retrospect, I definitely think that influenced how this came together. Ironically, I didn't intend for it to look like a money sign, but it did. It's just how it came out. So, of the things in this installation I like the most, and I think if you've ever done a residency or something like that, you really feel like you have a lot of momentum when you get to the end of it. Like you're like, oh, if I just had another couple weeks, you know? But the parts I like the most in here is up here. There's this wall trim that I added in, and this is really just the rebar you use when you're pouring curbs on the street. That's the kind of structure that goes within there. And the other piece I quite liked was this one over here, which was the month of June for when the show was running, right? Because every office has a calendar, of course. So it was those subtleties that I wish I had more time to take advantage of. So, to continue, West Virginia also likes to lay claim to the story of John Henry, right? You guys remember this story? I feel like this is something I grew up with that was very sort of common, right? It really likes to lay claim to the story of John Henry. And John Henry, the way West Virginia tells the narrative, in 1870, John Henry showed up to bore this tunnel and to face off against this machine in which he actually was able to bore the tunnel faster than the machine, but ultimately worked himself to death and died of exhaustion, right? And so I feel like these are the pictures that I think of when I think about the story as it was told to me as a kid. This is the more Disney version. This is the more stoic picture book version, right? But in my mind, knowing what I know now and sort of thinking back about it, I can't help but thinking that the Hawk's Nest in those situations were much more akin to the narrative, that this was a more shared experience. This is a full supposition of my own, right? There's no one else. This is me just sort of making these connections and thinking about how do we get to this romanticized story, this mythology, when we have countless people who have died from the same thing. This is a picture of just a regular sink. At some point with this idea of John Henry, before I understood it the way I understood it now, I thought about it in this more romantic aspect, right? And so As a person who does ceramics, I have this big reverence for all of our most common ceramic objects: sinks, toilets, bricks, those sorts of things. So I decided at some point that I was going to recreate a modern sink by hand building it, right? Through using my fingers, pressing together clay and coils in recreating the sink. And I'm admitting this shamefully, but I can admit it, that at the time, with this false understanding of the John Henry story, I referred to this as the John Henry sink, which, knowing what I know now, I would not do, right? This story to me is much more than that, right? So, last year, during the Youngstown State University show, I was installing this sink, and it fell off the wall. So I don't actually have it anymore either, right? Don't worry, I made multiples, so I have another one, but this one, as referred to, no longer exists. Which brings me to the next thing, the Youngstown State University show. So I was honored to be featured as the African American History Month, as they call it at Youngstown State University, their guest artist to have a solo exhibition in the Solomon Gallery on behalf of the McDonough Museum. And on the other side of this picket fence is the entrance into the gallery. And so I set up this fence. It was a second iteration of a piece. I also sort of feel that this was maybe a post-election kind of piece for me. Thinking about borders, divides, who owns what, right? And who has the right to what spaces, right? And just how something as simple as a fence can have all these implications. And also be nice and look good on your lawn and those sorts of things, right? How something like this nice fence could also be so divisive, can be a line for standing your ground, etc. So this is the entrance to the space, so immediately you had to walk around it. And this is, if you can see the reflection in the picture, right, with your back to the entrance, sort of looking into the rest of the space. Now, what I'd like to talk about for this particular work is these frames, and I have more pictures of those in a second. And I'd like to talk about how I got to thinking about making those frames. But before I do that, let me continue. So this is a picture of me I took at the very end of the opening while they're cleaning up. And it's just, basically like a selfie, something to throw on Instagram. But it was the only way I could find to show you guys the remainder of the space, the part that was missing over here on the wall. So I should go back. Right behind this wall over here is this piece. Now, this was the piece that was in the Whitney Museum as a part of the Debt Fair exhibition. And this piece is, I call it the gold tooth plate. It's a portrait of the artist with a gold tooth. So I don't actually have a gold tooth. You could probably tell from there, right? But it's just my mouth, my teeth on the plate. Now, one, that was a really big thing to be able to have a piece in, one, that museum, that kind of exhibition. But two, there's someone that was important to me that saw this piece. And so I have a favorite scholar. Their name is Glenn Adamson. They're an art historian. They focus mostly thinking about contemporary craft and what that means in the 21st century, right? And so I'm a big fan of their work. I even teach out of the compendium they put together in the classroom. Now, I went to a lecture of Glenn Adamson's, and I brought my books, and I had them sign it for me. I was very excited. And in the conversation with Glenn Adamson, I said that I had a piece that was currently at the Whitney. In which he said, well, what was it? And I described it, and he was like, oh, I saw it. I know that piece. I remember it. Big moment for me. Really big, right? Like, whew, that was a lot. So we'll get back to that too. So this is what is Glenn Adamson's most seminal piece, right? This is the part that really put him on the map. It's called Thinking Through Craft. And the book is looking at craft, right, through several ways. One, its relationship to modern art, right, in terms of it is the physicality, it is the use of material, it is the skill, right? He also talks about craft in its material specificity, right? And he also talks about what it is to be skilled. Now, in the chapter about the supplemental, he establishes this discussion of craft aiding art, right? The physical aspect to it, right? By talking about Immanuel Kant, right, in the frame, talking about the paragon, and talking about Derrida, right? And as he's discussing the frame, a picture is created in my mind, right? And the frame is the center of this discussion because it's talking about it being the signifier, essentially a border to recognize the piece of art, for us to be aware of what it is. And in this work, I became much more interested about trying to invert that and get the frame to actually become the thing. It is itself. It's talking about itself. So, and in doing this, thinking about that, I tried to take places like the intersection here, where it's joined, right, and highlight that, right? So this is actually a really messy intersection, a really messy joint, but I tried to highlight it and then put a gold luster on it, right? So to make it so that the connection actually becomes the part that's most visible. I even use these gold painted nails to hang up the piece, right? Same sort of thing, right? Where this thing that you wouldn't notice at all, the thing that's the most unseen, that's performing and presenting the work, now gets to be what's most highlighted. Right? I also, some of these I kept open so that they can move out into the wall so that they weren't full perimeters. As well as some as I kept closed. Okay, well, so we're back to this photo again. And the difference between this one and the last one is one, it's a full body shot, but two, there's a picture of this rim here, okay? And I have an interest in these car rims. I also want to say I don't have any on my car. There's no rims on my actual car, but I'm very much interested in what they are as status symbols. Part of this has to do just sort of like where I grew up, how I grew up, but I'm also interested in the idea of highbrow and lowbrow, so I'm really interested in like the highest of the lowbrow status symbols, right? So these are actually really, really expensive rims. These are like the ones they talk about in all the songs, okay? So here they are on cars, right? And so on the one hand, this is really kind of absurd, but on the other hand, I can't stop looking at it, and it goes back into that thing of status too, where I still read this as such a showing of status. Like if you can, you would, right? Here's another one. I mean, this is a really, really glossy photo. This is really, really what I think they intend all of this to look like. This one is not necessarily what I feel like it's intended to look like, but I'm equally as awestruck by this Volkswagen. And I like how they have the original wheel here too, so you can really see the difference, okay? So for me, the rim that you saw in the last photo, right, in front of the window, that was one that I had started maybe 8 or so years ago, trying to work on a series of these, and they pretty much all but that one that you saw ended in disaster. And this is a series that I started more recently, right? So I've started these here at Denison, and these are full size. They're about that big when they're sitting on the ground. And the thing about a car wheel, a rim, right, in a pottery form is that they're actually very, very similar. It's really just a 90-degree turn from one to the other. So making these, I set myself up on the wheel and I throw these foot-tall, 2-foot, 30-inch wide cylinders, and then I start to build all the pieces into the center. All right. And so of these, this seems to be the one that most people give the oohs and ahs. So this one is, again, full-size ceramic rim, right? but all of the Louis Vuitton patterns and images I had screen printed and transferred onto the rim. I mean, this is one of the more labor-intensive things that I've done. So this was the piece that I finished this maybe in May or June and was shopping it around all summer. And this is the piece that actually opened up the doors to getting the show titled Airplane Mode at the World's Fair Gallery, the gallery in Providence, Rhode Island. Right? And so here we are, you can see the piece in the window. This is kind of how I wanted it, you know? Like if you ever see like the big fancy rim stores, there's always rims in the windows. And so that's something I definitely wanted. The majority of the work isn't necessarily like these. These are the window pieces. Okay? And this is another one that was being shown, and I really like the way that this one was installed. If you can see on the left, the building itself has these weird neoclassical columns. Here's another one, and I just thought it was so cool to have the rim positioned on this other little column. I also really like this photo too. So the bulk of the work in the Airplane Mode show that I presented is a lot like this. And this was another piece that I had made the beginning of the summer, but just sort of like me thinking about these status objects and sort of like at what point can I start to take this Louis Vuitton pattern and abstract it and obscure it and start to get it to disappear a little bit. This piece is actually in the chair's office. So this was kind of where it started, thinking about like this, right? And then late summer, early fall, I had read another essay of Glenn Adamson's called The Rise of the Hyperpod. And in The Rise of the Hyperpod, Glenn Adamson is mostly talking about work that looks more like this, right? These pottery forms that are glazed in this way where there's lots of built-up surface, but he's talking about how good they look on the screen, you know, and how these pieces are being made to be online, right? And I was really interested in it, and although I read it, I didn't actually pull out any quotes, but I definitely know it influenced the steps I was taking in the decisions I was making, right? And so I want to quote a piece from The Rise of the Hyperpod, and there's some parts in there that are highlighted, but I'm going to read all of it. It happens in 2 slides, and he's referring to the hyperpods here. These new works announce a new visual rhetoric for the medium, one based on saturated color, density of texture, and lack of finicky detail. They are at least as good in reproduction as they are in person. Call them hyperpods. Though literally saturated in materiality, they are also primed to perform on the digital stage. Should this bother us? It was a long time ago that Jean Baudrillard predicted the procession of simulacra, by which he meant that simulations would begin to overtake reality and set the conditions for its unfolding. In so many ways, the 21st century has borne out of his insight. More and more, actual life contorts itself into the shape of its already existing representations. Cause and effect seem to have switched places. This is true in our politics, it is true in our economics. As attention itself gradually displaces other forms of value, it is true in our film, our fashion, why not our pottery? I really, really like that part. And again, when I was making the work, I didn't think about it in the same way. I just kept thinking about this notion of a hyperpod. So to talk more about the work that I presented, the work ends up looking either like these very questionable piece of decorative arts, or more sort of engaging in abstraction with paintings. This is a 2-piece set. It goes together under one title called Put Your Coin in That Machine and Keep On Playing. And here's some details of each. My thoughts making this work was a little less of starting in the studio and making something for it to exist online. It was more about starting online and thinking about how that affects what I'm doing in the studio and then trying to send it back. And using layers of printing seemed to do pretty well for my aesthetic goals. This is the one piece that actually sold a couple pieces, but this piece sold in the show, and it ended up selling to someone who, it ended up selling to the person that was in charge of all the galleries at RISD while I was there as an undergrad. And they were the person that organized the show, like my big senior show. And I feel like I have to send them a Christmas card with an apology to be like, I am sorry, I was such a messy student back then. Thank you for buying this piece. And I don't know if you guys can hear this. There's a small bit of music. I decided I was going to start posting these on Instagram, right? And I wanted to post them on Instagram, and I have these little music clips that go with them, and they play on loop as long as you're looking at the piece. And I was thinking about, like, it's this whole online thing. Long story short, to get to it, I emailed Glenn Adamson to be like, hi, do you remember me? We met a long time ago. You signed my books. You told me you remembered my piece. Okay, well, I'm making this work. I was thinking about your most recent essay, and I was hoping that you would let me start quoting parts of the essay for my Instagram posts, things like that. And so I'll have you guys all know, he got back to me yesterday and said, yes, I'm allowed to. So I have permission. These plates very obviously are playing into the long history, right, of blue and white ceramic ware and also the willow print, right? Certain kind of pattern. And these were generated primarily using the pattern from a Nike shoe footprint. And the funny thing is I've actually had students come up to me and be like, ooh, I know what shoe that is. So. And this is my last slide. I thought I'd finish with this, what I thought was a really, really nice picture. And if you look close enough, you can start to see me in it. So, thank you guys.